to this webinar, AWA webinar. I introduce myself to start with, so you know who I am. I'm the founder of Ventures with Agile, and I've got about 20 years plus of organizational change experience. I founded AWA about 4 or so years ago to connect people in this industry with each other, because typically this is a hard and lonely job sometimes, and I thought that we needed a bit of connection between ourselves. And so AWA is foremost a community of practice, and I've been very fortunate really throughout this last 4 or so years to have worked with and have hosted many of the thought leaders, framework founders, people working all across organizational change in Agile, Lean, and in psychology and all sorts of other areas. I've been very fortunate to learn and train and work with them. Also, being head of consultancy, I have been in the fortunate position to also work with many, many clients, perhaps more than an individual might, across very different industries and different levels within the organizations. So hopefully throughout that experience, with all that experience that I've gained, hopefully I can share some of that today in this webinar, and hopefully you can all gain something out of that. So, so what I'd like to do first of all is actually thank you, VJ, for your help in making this possible. And you've even got your own slide here. So thank you for doing that. You know, this is a community effort. So as always, we rely on people, in this case yourself, for marketing this and making this possible. So thank you. What we're going to do is we have an agenda for today. And whilst I'm talking about the agenda, if you want to, so this is an invite for everybody who's participating we have a chat window. So Zoom has a chat. If you're able, so obviously if you're driving or something else, don't do this. But if you are in a safe location, feel free to use the chat window just to say your name. I think you can have a slide for this too. Share your name and where you're joining from, because this is a global effort, and it's always interesting to see where we're all from. And we can see that this isn't a national or a one culture experience. This is actually a global change which is happening. So feel free to do that in the chat window, and we can then see that. So the agenda for today is going to be about 20-25 minutes of me talking. I'm going to go through a slide deck talking about 3 different questions. And those questions come up frequently in the training and the consultancy, and especially around coaches asking these kind of things. So the 3 questions are: how do you measure the value of a coach? The second question is how to sell Agile to leadership. And the third question is, why is it so difficult, or why is it so hard, and what can we do about that? So we're going to be looking at these 3 questions. And if during this presentation you have questions, please again use the chat, and Charlie will very kindly read out those questions. And for the last sort of, I don't know, whatever it is, 15-20 minutes or so at the end of this session, I'll do my best to answer some of those questions, and then we'll finally close. So the whole thing will be 45 minutes from the start. Okay, so let's answer the first question. So, how do you measure the value of an Agile coach? So this is a question which comes up quite a lot and is of concern, obviously, for many of the change agents, whether it's Agile coaching, whether it's a consultant, or whatever you call yourself, whatever the role name is, for us going into organizations, and even those who are working as permanent members of staff. You know, how do you measure this? Typically in organizations, things are measured in output, how much stuff you get done, but that doesn't work for a coach. So let's examine this question. So what I've done is I've changed the format. I don't normally do this in slides, so hopefully this can be useful to you. We've written out some of the key points as word statements in the slide deck. This is kind of a new format we're trying, so obviously feedback if you think this is good or not. So, so the first thing I'd like to talk about in terms of the value of an Agile coach is really to think about this in terms of outcomes rather than output. And we find that there's a really odd conundrum that comes when we come into organizations. And I'm going to walk you through that now. So the first kind of statement is a simplification of organizations, but it helps us think about this problem quite nicely. If you think that there are two types of employees in an organization, one being managers and the other type being workers creating value. Whether that's the right name, you want to call people in development teams, people producing code, people producing designs, things that the customer is going to consume. So obviously this is a simplification and many people play both roles, but we're going to simplify it like that for sake of for conversation. So if we have these two types of employees in an organization, we find that there are actually two types of problems. So workers tend to solve, and I'm going to call them team members workers just for the sake of brevity in this discussion. So it sounds a bit odd calling people workers, but for want of a better word, I'm just going to use that word for now. So forgive me for that. Workers solve technical problems and managers solve people problems. So maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but if we think of it like that, bearing in mind we're trying to answer this question about how to value a coach, then what we can see is that we've got these two very distinct type of problems. So technical problems are things like product delivery problems, code problems, deployment problems, even process problems, what ways of work. People problems are things like how do we relate to each other, how do we behave, what kind of language do we use, how do we show up, those kind of things. So if we take this down a bit further, we can see that there's actually two different cultures around these two types of problems. In organizations, it is totally fine to have technical problems. So we all know how to solve these kinds of problems. We get together, we brainstorm, we talk about these things, and we've got processes and we've got language and we've got communication ideas and stories around why it's difficult to solve these and it's okay. People problems is a different matter. People problems are, we don't have the vocabulary around it, they're difficult conversations, and typically it's not okay to have people problems. So if managers are seen to have problems, then this can typically be that they are seen to be incompetent, especially if they can't solve those problems themselves. So what I've seen in organizations is that if technical people have problems, that's okay. If managers have problems, that's not okay. And so these two cultures have come around the different types of problems and the different languages. So we have this, this difficult dilemma. So let's just park that for a second. So if we look at what we're asked to do as consultants or agile coaches, then really what we're trying to do is get business results. We're trying to improve business. And the first stage of any good or effective coach or consultant to be to ask, why am I here? What's the point of me being here? And to define what that real underlying business problem is. Now, from the Agile Manifesto, we know that individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So if we look at individuals and interactions, we can sum that up as people. If we look at processes and tools, let's sum that up as process. So we know that from an Agile perspective, we want to focus on people over process. And if we get the people side of things right, then we can generally derive the right business process and solve technical problems. So here we have an Agile coach or an Agile way of thinking saying that people are the most important thing. And technical stuff can come later. Yes, we need both. It's over, not instead of, in the Agile Manifesto. So we need both, but we want to focus on people. So the two types of problems, technical problems, people problem. So as Agile coaches, we want to come in and solve people problems. But the current way of thinking in organizations is that people problems are managers' realm, and that is not an okay to have these problems. And so we have a conflict. So the conflict is that often we're told as Agile coaches that there is no problem. And then what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to make things better. So a typical consultant will come in and not say, hey, look, there's loads of problems here. What we say is like, well, everything's going well, but we're going to try and make it better. And that's kind of the reason why. We're brought in not to solve problems, but to make things better. However, no matter what the managers say, there's always a problem, and it's always a people problem. So what I have found is that no matter where the problems lie, if you trace them back, it's a people problem. So you can see that now we have this dilemma, this conflict, and that's where some of these challenges lie. So what do we do about this? We've got to find a way around this. So I'm just going to move my screen slightly. There we go. Let's reset my layout. Cool. So what this leads us to is that we know that we need to solve people problems. The Agile, we're pretty much coming in the industry now to understand that the real blockers are culture, the way people behave, the interactions between people, how people believe and what they see about their work and how they relate to each other. We kind of know that's the key thing, culture. But we can't really face those directly because that's would seem to be undermining management. So this raises the question, how can we take credit and own those problems as coaches when we can't actually take credit for them? Managers have to be able to solve these problems themselves, as it undermines their own culture and the way that they're seen to need to solve these problems themselves. So whether you're a manager or a coach, this is kind of the dilemma that we face. So how do we know how a coach is valued, and how do you see your own value if you can never take credit for the work you do? Because by taking credit, we're undermining ownership for those that we work with, and that takes away from their power, and it also means that managers then are in this tricky dilemma. Oops. So what we're looking for is to understand this dynamic really well. So, sorry, I'm struggling with the tech here. Okay, good. So an effective coach and an effective manager should understand, or can understand, this dynamic. Coaches are there to solve people problems, but managers are there to solve people problems too. So it's not in anyone's interest to raise the question, how valuable or what is a coach's value? And so really an effective coach and an effective manager understands this relationship, and we make sure that that question is never asked. However, what this does is this then leads to the dilemma, well, surely an effective or a non-effective coach are going to also want to make sure this question is never asked. So how can we tell the difference between an effective coach and a non-effective coach? Well, the best way to tell whether a coach is effective is whether managers are solving their problems. And if they're solving more problems with the coach around, then they will know. And so this becomes a symbiotic relationship where the question of whether a coach, what the value of a coach is, really doesn't want to be asked. And if it is being asked, it means we don't understand this relationship. And so this is kind of making people aware of this, but in a very kind of roundabout way, is really the key to this. So an example with one of our clients, the measure of whether our coaches are successful is whether the central funding group asks and talks to the manager which the coach is paired with and says, is this coach being effective? And if the manager says yes, the coach stays. If the manager says no, then we see whether we can make that coach more effective, whether that relationship works or not, and whether we can improve that. And then obviously if it doesn't work, then we need to think of something else. And so it's a subjective thing, how to measure it, and it's based upon that relationship of whether the manager is solving these problems. So I know that doesn't totally give you a hard mathematical figure in terms of how a coach is measured, but hopefully that gives you an understanding of why this is so difficult and why really you don't want to be measuring a coach and how much they are. You really want to be looking at managers and seeing how well they're being solved. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second question. We'll take a look at questions and things at the end. And the second question is around selling Agile to leadership. And this comes up a lot in our training classes, especially when we're dealing with leadership or enterprise agility. How do we sell Agile to leadership? Well, again, unfortunately, this isn't going to be a straightforward answer to this question. Otherwise, it would have been solved and no one would answer it. But I can help you with it. And so I would ask you, even though on a webinar you can't answer, I would ask you to look at in yourself and see, how does it feel when you're being sold something? If someone is calling you up, perhaps on a weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and they're trying to sell you something like double glazing or air conditioning or insurance or some other thing, it doesn't feel particularly good. And quite often we can sometimes see even a hostile reaction. And when I've asked people this question before, very rarely do I get a pleasurable, someone has a pleasurable experience being sold to. So if we put ourselves in leadership's position, then how does it feel to them for us to come and sell them Agile? So really, we shouldn't be selling Agile at all. If we try and sell Agile to leadership, typically we get the response, thank you for the inconvenience, and a massive load of resistance. So the answer here is to understand the business results and the business problems that they face. We are there as servant leaders and we have to embody that. So as a coach or consultancy or internal coach, we're looking to build a relationship, a real relationship, through listening, through either coaching and deep understanding of the actual real business problems that managers and senior leaders face. And then working with them to understand that problem, we may just use some Agile tools and lean tools and other things around our body of experience and knowledge to help them solve their own problems. So what we're looking for is to solve business problems, not do or even be Agile, because being or doing Agile is kind of a means to an end, not a thing in itself. So if you're seeing things like Agile maturity models, Agile kind of assessments, all those kind of things, there's a proxy variable for whether you're really solving business value. And you could be going down a blind alley there by thinking Agile is the end rather than a means to an end, and that creates resistance. So in answer to that question, I would say don't sell Agile to leaders. Instead, work with them, understand what the real problems are, and perhaps use Agile to try and solve those. So we're going to move on to the third question. And this is, why is it so hard, and how to make it a bit easier? So this one's a bit straightforward to answer than the other two questions, and hopefully will give you a bit more of a concrete way forwards. So I'd like to introduce you to two things, if you haven't already seen these. And these are the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a human bias. And we all suffer from this. And this is where we are so, this is the bias. If we are so ignorant or just have no experience in a particular topic, such that we don't even know what this topic, the limits of this topic are, we have an unusually high confidence in the topic, more than perhaps we should do. And so this, an example of that is when perhaps an exec or senior leadership or senior management or someone purchasing an Agile solution says, oh, I totally get Agile, I totally know it, I understand all there is to know, don't need to learn any more, but actually they don't really have a clue. And this comes again because of this problem around managers and leaders seeming to have to know everything and have all the answers. And so, so what happens is this creates an opportunity for people to sell solutions which don't necessarily work. And this is where I'd like to introduce you to the second term, which is the Agile Industrial Complex. So this is a kind of a take off the military industrial complex, where what's happening is it creates a perfect storm. We can't talk to management about people problems, about culture, because of what we discussed in the question one, but we can talk to them about technical problems. So what happens is we get a whole bunch of people, consultancies, framework creators, and people who are looking at the technical issues, these kind of things, creating tools, creating frameworks, and selling those to executives who would much rather have technical problems to solve than people problems. So what happens here is that most organizations we find at this peak of ignorance about solving complex adaptive problems, which is through no fault of their own. The businesses have worked very well solving complicated or non-complex adaptive problems for a very long time. It's a relatively new thing, the level of disruption in the markets, technology, and the pace of change And so it's natural that people need to learn a whole new way of working to solve these problems. But what happens is that we're not there yet in organizations. So we have a peak of ignorance through no fault of anyone. And this allows the Agile industrial complex to sell technical solutions which have a typical lead time of about 14 months to failure. And so this is why Agile is not living up to the dream. Yes, we're definitely getting some improvements across the industry, but unfortunately they're not the amazing improvements that we had hoped for. And this is because we're not addressing those problems. We're selling in tools and frameworks because that fits very nicely with the existing culture, and a whole industry is spun up around that, which is causing, unfortunately, a failure within a sort of 12-month, 2-year window. So what do we do about this, right? So, well, before we move on to that, the next slide, if you are able to see this, then this is kind of summed up nicely. What presentation would be complete without a Dilbert cartoon? So if you'd like to have a read of that. This kind of duality that exists at the moment. We want everyone to be safe, we want inclusion, we want diversity, but you better get the results. And we're in this stage at the moment where organizations are kind of half there. They kind of know they need to change, but they don't know how. And we're selling them in the Agile industrial complex is selling them tools in one hand, but not addressing the underlying issues. And we end up with this kind of like weird kind of situation where we're doing Agile, but not really getting results. So what do we do about this? What's happening at the moment, if we look at the Agile Onion, then for those of you who are familiar with the Agile Onion, it kind of describes the different layers of Agile. And the Agile industrial complex, what's happening is we're selling things in that bottom part of the onion, which are practices. We're selling Scrum, Kanban, SAFe, etc., these kind of things. And we're doing those to people, and we're supplying a whole bunch of tools. And I say we, meaning an industry-wide, because I feel like I belong to the community of Agile, although I'm not proud of some of these practices that go on. And what's happening is that we're not addressing the top part of the onion, which actually is the most powerful part, but often the least visible. So this is the mindset, values, and principles. So let's have a look at what this mindset actually means, because execs don't want to be talking about Yoda and powerful force and all that. We need to make this explicit. So to find the mindset, we have 3 beliefs. There are only 3, there's not 4. There are just 3 beliefs of what it requires for the Agile mindset. The first one is about predictability. And we know that the type of problem, software development in particular, is not predictable over the long run. And so we need to get our heads around this. And if we are looking at predictable models of software development or product development, service development, then we're simply not going to embrace the experimentation needed to solve these problems at scale. The people belief is around treating people with unconditional positive regard. Too many of our organizations are set up with processes to protect the organization against the 1% who doesn't want to work, wants to slack off, or whatever, whereas the 90% suffer and are locked down and are unable to have the necessary space for innovation and powerful teams. So we need to really address this, our beliefs around our workforce. And the third belief is the proactivity in self-improvement or improvement in general. And this is about improving ourselves as human beings, improving the teams that we work in, the organizations we work in, the processes we work with, and our products and services to customers. We need to constantly be looking at this in a rapidly changing environment. The interesting thing about this mindset belief, these mindset beliefs, is that pretty much every single problem in an agile transformation or organizational change can be traced back to someone of influence not believing in one or more of these beliefs. All of the other stuff that comes out of that, all of the dysfunction comes back to someone who has made some kind of change, not having one of these beliefs. So it's very powerful and a good way of looking at things in terms of working with the exec, working with the leadership team. So let's dig down into the values now. So the values is the next part. And the values really, for those of you who have come across the Aristotle project for Google, I'm not going to go into that now. You can Google that. The 2 things that came out of that, and have been there ever since Alistair Coburn's work in the late 90s, is psychological safety. and equal voice. So having psychological safety means that people can speak up. They have respect for each other. You're able to voice things which are things out of the box, out of the marginalized opinions, the elephants in the room. That is diversity. It's about being able to have diverse opinions and being okay with that. It means including all of those opinions around the edge, because when we do that, we create equal voice. And only then can we create ideas and things that aren't the norm, and that's innovation. Now, the challenge here, and that would be fairly straightforward to put processes in place. The challenge here is that when we create diversity, when we create inclusion, it means that there are going to be opinions which you don't believe in. There are going to be opinions which are going to challenge you as an individual, which means that we're going to have a physiological, physiological stress response at times to some of the opinions that come up. And that means we're going to have an emotional response. So there needs to be a willingness from participants to manage their own emotions. This is emotional intelligence and team emotional intelligence, such that we're able to really have true diversity in opinion. And only then can we create the type of organizations which can solve complex adaptive problems. So moving on, so what are we doing with this? So at AWA, we've been working, creating training and in our consultancy and experimenting with these core ideas, the top part of the onion, putting it into process and into a playbook, which allows us to work in a good way without threatening those existing underlying cultures, without challenging things, to build really good relationships with senior leaders, management teams, etc., so that we're able to put the right kind of structure and processes and things in place to allow those values to arise, such that we can then shorten that feedback loop and solve these types of complex problems at an organizational level, not just at the team level. So we have, so obviously that's a whole massive topic, and we've got a couple of what we're calling the Agile Boot Camp for coaches. This is an enterprise level class. We're running one in London and one in Chicago, November and December respectively. And I think there's a few places left. And on this class, we take you through the entire thing of everything from leadership to structural changes, to people, to coaching, all this kind of stuff, which gives you that skill then to be able to use what we're doing at AWA to help with these big scale organizational changes. So I hope that answers those three questions. And I think now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to some Q&A. And I think, Charlie, I'll stop sharing my screen now. So hopefully you'll be able to see me. And so what we're going to do is, if I haven't been looking at the chat, because I have been looking at the slides. So if there are any questions that you have as part of this, now would be a good time to put them in the chat. And if we've got anything there, if Charlie, you'd like to read any out, then I will do my best to answer them. So I'm just looking.
Hi.
Hiya.
So I can see that there's nothing in the chat at the moment, so people might be writing out questions, but I'm happy to stick my voice out so you can have one to answer while people maybe are typing furiously away.
Thank you, Ben.
So I've had a couple of discussions with people at a higher level within my company, and quite often they say, fundamentally, you're going to come down to a waterfall bedrock. So you can be agile at the cliff edge, but eventually you get up to someone who says, actually, I need to set my budget 2-3 years in advance. I have no choice about that. So I need, I heard from someone in another organization, they wanted delivery certainty. Now, thankfully, that's not mine. But people say, I need to know what I'm getting so I can commit the budget so you can do it. So you can do whatever you like at the ground level, provided you commit to me, you're doing exactly this over exactly this time. Is that necessary in large organizations, and can we help to resolve it?
Yeah, brilliant question. And it's one that comes up time and time again. So if we look at the agile mindset, then what we can see is that here, the complexity belief is not held. So this is the belief that in predictability. So the underlying belief is that whatever problem we're solving is predictable. And however you IT guys want to run your show, I still want the predictability. But we unfortunately know from years of experience that the problems that we're trying to solve typically are not predictable. So we have this dichotomy of beliefs. And what I found useful here is asking finance people to come and sit with the teams, to come and introduce them to the ways of working, and so typically in finance, we're looking at risk. So what we want to do is we want to introduce them to the nature of work, get people to sit with the teams, see what the nature of work is, and then figure out how we can mitigate that risk that they're worried about in a different way. And luckily for us, it just so turns out that working in an agile, lean way happens to be a hell of a lot riskier than putting all your money in one pot and hoping for the best in sort of 6 months or even sometimes a couple of years ahead. So it's a relationship, and it's a changing of belief, but underlying it's a risk problem. And so I'd approach that in that way. Does that answer your question, Ben?
Yeah, it gives me a good steer. Thank you.
Cool. Great.
I got a question here from Thesk, and they ask, what are the structures you are going to be discussing either in London or Chicago?
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. So this is another really good question. So what structures do we look at? So some of the things that, so there's different types of structures. We look at everything from hierarchical and where we go from here. We start looking at what happens when organizations flatten, things of communities of practice, that kind of thing, and ways to hack the existing structure so that we can be more efficient without doing too much to the organizational chart and things like that. And we're also looking at large-scale facilitation. So getting people together who are working on a product, looking at identity. So people identify with themselves, with teams, and then looking at their identity in terms of the product and things like that. So we're using large-scale facilitation to try to circumvent some of the silo mentality and breaking up of both skill silos and component or code-based or product silos, and even silos such as marketing, sales, finance, those kind of things. So really looking at facilitation to kind of work with that. But one thing I must emphasize when we talk about structure is that there is no right structure. No, I mean, there is a right structure, but it's different for everyone. And so it's really around allowing the right mindset to occur such that we can iteratively work towards the appropriate structure for the organization to solve the types of problems that it has. And so we take you through that whole process of figuring out how to do that and what's appropriate and how you incrementally change to something without causing too much disruption. Hopefully that answers that question.
The next one we have is from Danielle, and he asks, what if an organization wants to change at the worker level, but the leadership is totally against change, and their answer is to impose more command and control?
Yeah, I haven't got a very happy answer for you, Danielle, unfortunately. Leaders set the tone. So leadership sets the tone for the organization. And what I mean by that is that the behaviors create the mindset and the culture of the organization more than anywhere else. So we can create bubbles in an organization such that a leader of a particular part of the organization can set the tone for that one part. And then typically there's like a translation layer between that and the rest of the organization. But if you actually have no leaders in support, and this is what we call a bottom-up transformation, then typically what you have is a shallow wave adoption, which means that you get some success for a while and teams start improving. And yes, you can get some improvement at the team level, but soon that's going to fizzle out. And my experience shows that it's going to run out of steam because often the real impediments to delivering agility are wider and bigger than the team, which can't be solved from a bottom-up approach. So if the leadership don't want it, it's their company, it ain't going to happen. Sorry. What's next? That gloomy note.
Michael Herman says, suggestion, safety is a halfway solution. Purpose is what really matters. Meaningful purpose, meaningful to the people who are needed to accomplish it. And then when we know and believe in such purpose, people can orient themselves to that, choose their actions in line with that, and thus explain their decisions in that shared context. So it seems to me that safety isn't about behaviour as it's commonly reduced. It's about really important shared purpose.
Awesome. Long question. Hopefully I can answer it in a succinct way. So thank you for that. You're absolutely right. Purpose is key. The challenge comes when we look at the scope of the purpose and who has created that purpose. So what we're looking for is to try to facilitate something where the purpose is actually a mutuality of benefits between leadership and workers, if you like, and so that the purpose becomes a combined effort. So I've worked with one organization where if you ask the board what the purpose is, they're very clear on the purpose. If you ask the senior leadership team what the purpose is, they're very clear on the purpose. And then you ask the workers what the purpose of the business is, and they're very clear on the purpose. And then you compare all three, and they're completely different. And so purpose is a very independent and individual way of looking in the world. And so what we're looking to do is create and facilitate something where purpose can be understood and there's a mutuality of benefits. But you're absolutely right. Without purpose, there cannot be a team, there cannot be an organization, and people go in different ways. And that doesn't create a proper functioning or high-performing team. They both are important, and it's a bit of a circular argument, because how do you create a purpose where everyone's included if you don't have safety? But then how do you create safety and everyone working together if you don't have purpose? So kind of the two things are important. That would be my answer. Does that help?
Yeah, you got me at the end. That you need some measure of safety.
Yeah.
To get the purpose, to get what matters. So that closed the loop, because I was surprised that safety in your assumption, your beliefs, led, and purpose was sort of the next piece. And I didn't understand that because I generally start the other way. So.
Yeah, and it's a cyclical thing. And we have a culture model, which we haven't got in this deck, but the culture model has a bedrock of mastery, and then there's purpose, and there's a bunch of other stuff that goes through, including safety and all these kind of things. So yeah, it's a multi-faceted challenge, if you like.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, you closed the loop for me. You got me at the end, and oh yeah, it's all like this and like that. Yes. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, no problem. Any more questions?
Aravind asks, what are some of the steps that effective Agile coaches / managers take in order to make their own value addition visible beyond their teams? In brackets.
So what are the steps that effective Agile coaches make in order to make their own value additional visible? Yes, okay, good, got it. What I do with the teams that we're working in, and typically parts of the organization we're working in, is right from the outset, build a communication plan and look at ways to sum up the kind of good work that you're doing. And this can typically be around the business results, not how agile you are, but how around what kind of business results we're looking for. Now, remember the credit thing here, not to take all the credit for it. So it's around generating something of that area in the business which is doing well, and something which you're achieving and succeeding at, and doing that regularly, just like a product review, where the stakeholders come in and review the product every sprint. You want to be doing this iteratively so that we're showing to the rest of the organization how well we're doing in this And that relationship I talked about managers and coaches, I see that as a mutuality of benefits, where the coaches make the managers look good and the managers support the coaches to make them look good. And if you get that balance right, and then you broadcast out through whatever communication plan you've got, then you've got a chance of making what you're doing visible in a wider area. Hopefully that can help.
Beth asks, how do you introduce that dilemma of avoiding the difficult question of helping the managers solve their problems?
Yeah, so first of all, don't call them problems, and don't make it so that the managers have problems, because as we've seen, that doesn't work. What we need is a relationship so that we can understand what the actual problems are, and then we look to improve. So we're always saying, all right, and what we look back on is, where are we now? And then we can say, what strengths have we had leading to where we are now? And where would we like to be? And what strengths can we use from where we are now to solve these problems going forwards? And that way we can use coaching and things to pull out those strengths, and then we can use those strengths as a way of solving these things going forward. So you can see, it really makes it obvious the strengths of the management team and what they're doing. So that kind of approach. We don't say, hey, you've got a bunch of problems and I'm here to fix them. That ain't going to go down very well at all.
If I jumped in right there and added something, a little piece of language, Harrison Owen, who discovered open space, as most people would know, I think, in this group, he described it as the question he always goes in with is, what's working? And he says, when we get a juicy list of that, he asks, how do we make more of it?
Yeah.
So
perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you for that.
Vijay asks, what are the special challenges for new coaches you see in organizations that are already on their Agile journey for a few years versus those starting out on their Agile journey afresh?
Brilliant question. So I see that I'm not that keen on the Shuhari kind of model, but it's useful. So when people are introduced to a new field, for example, new people coming into organizational change or Agile, then we're looking for the low-hanging fruit. We look for tools, we look for frameworks, we look for things that we can apply. And that's not a bad place to start. We've got to remember that a lot of these frameworks are part of this Agile industrial complex. And taking this stuff and doing it to people undermines the principles of self-organization and ownership. So the difficulties I see coming up is that we need a shift in the way that we think about Agile, in the way that we think about, we apply these tools and frameworks to the organization. And it's a shift from us being the experts and coaches to a collaborative effort solving business problems. So I see a move away from things like frameworks because I think they're an encapsulation of some great ideas and some great stuff, but they're one man with hammer thinks everything is a nail. That would be my feeling. So I think that at the moment we're still using those and they're still useful. 3 to 4 years, not so sure they're going to be around so much. I think we'll be looking at iterative solutions rather than here's a big framework, plonk it on top. So just be wary of learning loads and spending all your money on training specific frameworks, and look at really understanding the cultural aspect, those kind of sides, the behavioral aspects and things, and then seeing how you can use that to empower people to find their own structures and their own ways of working. That would be my advice.
Al asks, how do we deal with green over enthusiastic Agile people selling predictability? Is that the reason why SAFe is so popular?
How do we deal with green over enthusiastic Europeans selling predictability? SAFe made so popular. Okay, so green, I'm assuming you're meaning Frederick Lalo's model of culture model, meaning kind of the Agile family type or community type approach. I'm assuming that's what that means. Over-enthusiastic Agile people, yeah. So the idea of over-enthusiasm is that, we know this, we're really passionate. We are a bit nerdy in this community, and we're really passionate about making people's working lives better. We're passionate about good products and services and organizations. And in that passion, in that enthusiasm, we forget one vital ingredient. It's not our organization. Even if you work there as an employee, the leaders run that organization. And us going in there, either treating them as the godlike CEO, or that they're idiots and you can run their company better, is absolutely not going to work. We have to build a partnership, we have to build a relationship, and that enthusiasm needs to come out through an equality of relationship in solving real business problems. And the reason why I think the SAFe framework is popular is because it's optimized around ease of deployment. And it means that it's all the right language, it's all the right stuff to solve that type of technical problem thinking. It doesn't address, although it has evolved somewhat lately, but it's an ease of deployment. And I don't want to say too much more on it because I don't want to get involved in framework wars, but I think that it addresses that want for the problem not to be a cultural or management or a people problem, but a technical problem, a process problem. And so you can get in there and sell that. So that would be my opinion on that. Okay, so the last thing was why this course, why bother with it, why go on it? So it's a week-long course, so it's quite a commitment. And what we do is we cover I mean, it's a huge field. It's a lifelong journey, this. And we've piled in all of AWA's experience, the people we've worked with, into a week-long immersive course, which is highly interactive. You will definitely have fun. You can do loads of experiments. We can do, we're doing loads of workshops. It's definitely not a lecture-based PowerPoint thing. It's really interactive. And what you come out of it for you is a much deeper understanding and a much new perspective. It's much a personal change, an internal change for you, and how you approach your work and success and relationships you have, as much as learning a set of deep skills and practices, real skills that you can take away and change what you're doing to have more success at an enterprise level. So I think that probably means that we should probably close, as we probably have gone over slightly. So thank you for all of the time that you have given me and others asking these questions. I really appreciate that. I know time is very valuable, so I won't take up any more of your time. I hope to see you on a class at some point, or perhaps at a community event, or somewhere in the Agile world.